One thing about Marvel Comics in the last 30 to 40 years is whenever they try to meet fan demand and create a new character, they basically just wind up remaking Peter Parker the Amazing Spider-Man.
Think about it. You get a teenager from a middle-class, middle-of-the-road family. They've always longed to be something more than what they are. They suddenly get power thrust upon them, and yet still they'll use that power selfishly, only to eventually learn.
All together now.
With great power comes great responsibility. Anyway, in 1991, Marvel would debut another teen superhero who's not only from Peter Parker's hometown of Queens, but also attended Peter's alma mater of Midtown High. This new triple-down Peter Parker would also borrow some aspects from the superhero Nova, aka Richard Rider, by coming into contact with an object from outer space that would eventually just coat him in power armor.
Well, I mean, there is technically a little bit more to the character of Darkhawk, who would become something of a cult hero, with a series that ran for 50 issues from 1991 to 1995. Unfortunately, a lot of those elements really aren't in the first 9 issues, which is what we're covering today. This is Darkhawk Classic, Volume 1.
Wonderland Amusement Park in Queens is scheduled for demolition. That being said, enforcers for crime boss Philippe Bazin accost a derelict named St. Johnny on behalf of their employer. A client of Bazin's is looking for a mysterious object of power, and when the bum just can't seem to recall anything of that nature being at the park, Bazin flips him a massive roll of 20s to spend on a fine vintage clinker brick and leaves. From there, the goons move on to a local courthouse in a continued attempt to bribe Assistant District Attorney Grace Powell in order to lay off Bazin's case. She naturally refuses, however this does lead to some threats against her family and the fact that they're not going to rearrange their furniture the next time they visit the house. This puts Grace's family even under more stress, including police officer Mike, sons Chris, Jonathan, and Jason. Mike in particular is almost totally defeated by the situation, just wishing that law enforcement had some sort of edge in order to take down Bazin. While both parents are out at work, Christopher is forced to kind of abandon his friends and look after his brothers. That being said, he foolishly stops paying attention just long enough for his brothers to sneak out and head over to Wonderland Amusement Park. Chris tracks down his 2 brothers playing around the local funhouse, and it's there that they spot what appears to be Mike accepting a bribe from Philippe Bazin's goons. However, though, it turns out to be a trap, and when the boys try to intercede, Mike is knocked out with a gun, and the trio try to run away, only to fall into another hidden room. Chris tries to border up any exit points and pushes his brothers into his closet, inadvertently grabbing a weird necklace with an amulet off of the mantle. The next thing Chris knows, the amulet has mysteriously relocated to his chest and formed a power armor around his body. He blasts the goons with a beam from his new chest stone and manages to begin toppling all of the funhouse around him. While Chris is able to revert back to his human form and get his brothers to safety, Mike takes the opportunity to slip away and go into hiding, knowing he'll never be able to clear his name. As the other cops arrive, Chris can't help but just keep the stone to himself, while St. Johnny in the background mumbles something about the power of the Darkhawk. The news about Mike Powell being a dirty cop further damages the family, with Jason just being in steadfast denial while threatening calls continue increasing. Chris resolves to use the power of this new Darkhawk to provide the edge needed to actually take down Bazin. However, in a funny twist, it turns out that this might be the object that Bazin has been looking for, on behalf of his major client, the Hobgoblin.
We don't have enough time to get into the whole tangled mess of the people who have donned the mantle of the Hobgoblin. Just know that this is the 4th, yes, technically 4th individual to wear that mask. Now, this Hobgoblin is Jason Macendale, a former mercenary who had been a previous costume villain with a similar theme called Jack-O-Lantern. Along the way, Macendale made a deal with the demon Nastir during the events of the X-Men Inferno crossover that caused his powers to be augmented but altered his physical appearance into a creature that's sometimes referred to as the Demogoblin.
Chris dons the Darkhawk armor again and takes the fight directly to Bazin by charging into the mobster's office. He begins dangling Bazin out through a window until the Hobgoblin intervenes, and Chris just isn't experienced enough to take on a villain of this caliber as the Hobgoblin begins ripping at the amulet in his chest. Things go from bad to worse when shrapnel from a pumpkin bomb gives Chris a rather severe cut. He ducks into an alley and has no other choice but to depower, which seemingly heals his wounds from the bomb. Reverting back to human form gives Chris the ability to just temporarily bluff off the Hobgoblin. Chris returns home to his continuously squabbling brothers, who then spot the Hobgoblin flying over Wonderland Amusement Park. Fearing that he may have been followed, relief comes to Chris when he spots Spider-Man swinging in to take on the costume villain. However, the sight of innocent beings being caught in the crossfire drives Chris to act once again, becoming the Darkhawk. Darkhawk and Spider-Man managed to team up and worked really well against the Hobgoblin until Darkhawk begins going for the kill, which just leaves Spidey completely aghast. While the two heroes squabble, the Hobgoblin gets away.
So what exactly type of abilities does the Darkhawk armor possess? Well, the amulet, which now sits on the chest, has the ability to channel Dark Force energy into a concentrated laser blast. He has Talon gauntlets that can be shot out for grappling capabilities and even used as a weapon. He also has wings that enable for short gliding stints, though that eventually turns into just full-blown flight. And he has your bog standard enhanced speed and strength.
Chris elects to take some time training the Darkhawk armor on a junked car, which eventually brings the attention of the police when the vehicle explodes. Given his father's current stature with the police, they aren't particularly happy to be dealing with another Powell, but Mike's ex-partner lets Chris go home with a warning, believing the teen to have just been practice driving. From there, Chris heads to school, where he has to deal with his girlfriend, Cheryl.
Yeah, Chris apparently had a girlfriend this whole time. It's news to me too. Other members of Chris's little high school clique include someone named Bob, someone named Janet, and a music enthusiast known as Headset.
While changing for gym class, Chris overhears some kids talking about Bazin working some type of deal out of the back room of one of his nightclubs. After school, Chris elects not to go home and instead spies on the arms deal going down at the club. Chris turns into Darkhawk once more and tries to interrupt the deal, only for it to be interrupted by the Hobgoblin. Thankfully, Spider-Man was tailing the Goblin the whole time, and the three begin fighting once more. Again, the two heroes seem to work pretty well together in managing to take down the Hobgoblin. However, once again, Darkhawk goes for the kill, which upsets Spider-Man to the point the two begin squabbling, and the Hobgoblin leaves, this time with a hostage. Spider-Man leaves Darkhawk with some advice to try to quit the whole killing idea, because that's just going to make him no worse than the Hobgoblin. However, it turns out that Darkhawk will not have to deal with the Hobgoblin anymore, as it turns out Philippe Bazin has informed him that Darkhawk's amulet is not exactly the item of power that he's been looking for.
Yeah, okay, obviously Basin's just clearing the Hobgoblin out of the way so he could take the amulet for himself.
Darkhawk breaks into Rikers Island Penitentiary in the cell of Louis McPhee, one of Basin's enforcers, to beat information about the money paid to Mike Powell out of him. All McPhee does is let slip of the location of another arms deal that's going down, and Darkhawk is forced to flee when the cops arrive. However, when McPhee takes a guard hostage and attempts to stage his own escape, Darkhawk is actually able to utilize a newly discovered sniper mode to take him down. That being said, Darkhawk is wounded once again trying to escape the prison and winds up having to ride ashore on a fishing boat. Chris eventually makes it back home, where his mother rips him continuously because he's constantly being late nowadays. Of course, Chris can't go into the full explanation, just offers to pick up some McDonald's for dinner. As he goes out to his bicycle, he winds up finding another note about Darkhawk taped to the bike. On the way home, Chris stops off at a bar that's frequented by off-duty police officers, only to be shouted out mainly due to his father's actions and, well, he's underage. Though Mike Powell's ex-partner of Jim Zafir tells Chris to just leave police work to the police. Chris tries to take Jim's advice and heads home to practice with the armor a little bit, even trying to go as far as to remove the top helmet, only to be interrupted at the last possible minute by his brother. Still, at the end of the day, Chris can't help but feel like he's being ignored by the police, and elects to try to break up this next arms deal for Bazin on his own again. He heads over to the airport where the arms deal is said to take place, and just before he can intercede, he's suddenly interrupted by a large, hulking, power-armored creature called Savage Steel.
There's not really much to go on with Savage Steel, other than the fact that his armor was made by none other than Obadiah Stane, aka the Ironmonger.
Darkhawk and Savage Steel brawl throughout the airfield, with Steel actually taking time to prove that he's not actually in Basin's employ by blowing up the smugglers. After getting tossed around by Savage Steel a little bit more, the two eventually leave, with Steel heading back to the cop bar from earlier, now wishing to target the Punisher instead of Darkhawk, as he's not sure where this new hero's leanings actually are. Meanwhile, a defeated Chris makes his way home, where he finally manages to look in the mirror and remove the Darkhawk helmet, only to be horrified by what he finds.
Basically what happens when Chris puts on the Darkhawk armor is that his body switches places with an android that's being held in some weird nether space realm. And in fact, Chris's consciousness is the only thing that stays behind because that dictates how the android works. Also, I should point out, whenever Chris is transformed all these times, no one really sees it, so outside of St. Johnny, no one really knows that Chris is Darkhawk.
Chris's loud reaction to what he sees in the mirror attracts the attention of his family, forcing him to change back and try to forget what happened. It's caused such a ruckus that none of the Powells have noticed the rather suspicious-looking vehicle parked in front of their home. Citing the need to clear his mind, Chris exits the Powell home and goes looking for St. Johnny for information on the Darkhawk. It turns out the homeless man actually knew the order of the previous Darkhawk armor and tells Johnny that the face behind the mask is the face all men deserve. The bum then vanishes again, leaving a dumbfounded Chris behind. The next day at the Natural History Museum, the Powells are approached by a man wielding a gun. Chris leaps into action, telling his mother to get his brothers to safety, only to wind up getting shot in the leg for good measure. However, it does buy him an ample amount of time to transform into Darkhawk and then go after the hitman. However, that all gets interrupted when a portal suddenly opens up in the middle of the museum and a large hulking individual in similar armor to Darkhawk, calling himself Portal, begins taking on the hero.
Portal is an indigenous American mutant by the name of Charles Littlesky who has the ability to teleport between dimensions via, well, a portal. Now, during one of these trips to another dimension, he encountered another Darkhawk, similar to Chris Powell, though technically not Chris Powell. However, it was in that confrontation that he picked up his Darkhawk-esque armor. Coincidentally, in that same trip, he also wound up confronting the villainous group, the UFOs, who I talked about in my Spider-Man Breakout review.
Portal and Darkhawk begin fighting throughout the museum as the former continuously targets the latter's power amulet. Though Chris tries to talk Portal down, it proves to be of little use. The battle climaxes as Portal opens up a portal, good lord, that's going to be repetitive, to take Darkhawk into, only for the latter to utilize his crystal for a power blast to finally take Portal down. Darkhawk is now able to turn his attention to the hitman, who immediately sells Bazin out at a moment's notice. Grace begins turning around the corner, causing Chris to have to revert back to his human form, which is wounded.
Obviously, when Chris reverts to his human form, he still has his gunshot wound, and this has proved so dramatic to Grace Powell that she's mysteriously gone from being a redhead to being a blonde. Sadly, that is not the only mistake involving hair in these books.
Chris is taken to a local medical facility where doctors are finally able to revert Grace's hair back to its normal color. While he recovers, he sees Portal being prepped for transfer to S.H.I.E.L.D.'s maximum security prison, the Vault. To that end, Chris wants to know what exactly is the deal with Portal and what he knows about Darkhawk. First things first, though, as Darkhawk needs to go after Bazin. He storms Bazin's compound and goes after the crime boss, going through the guards with relative ease, grabbing Bazin only to suddenly be halted by Bazin's family popping up. This consists of sons Broderick and Andrew and daughter Allegra. Allegra insists that if Darkhawk is going to kill their father, that he do it in front of their eyes to better fuel their revenge. It's enough to make Chris realize that he's probably made a bit of a mistake and he lets Bazin go. For now. Meanwhile, Grace Powell has been trying to locate her husband, only to wind up constantly being stonewalled by his former friends in the police department. All of this spurs Chris on to go and confront Portal, who's being looked after by Captain America. That unfortunately gets interrupted by the sudden appearance of the UFOs, and Darkhawk has to join Cap in fighting the villain team, which also winds up attracting of Little Sky's lawyer, Matt Murdock. Now that Daredevil has joined the fray, the battle begins to even things out as Murdock's heightened senses allow him to easily defeat the UFOs. All the commotion has awakened Portal, and Darkhawk finally manages to confront him about what he knows about the armor. Little Sky goes on to explain,
The cake is a lie! There, I did a Portal joke. Are you happy now?
In reality, Little Sky explains that someone in a Darkhawk armor tried to kill him, only for Portal to kill him first. Distraught over his actions, Portal teleports away before Darkhawk can learn any more, and when he returns home, Chris finds another threatening note. Elsewhere, Bazin has been working on a special project in order to finally take down Darkhawk. Its codename? Lodestone.
Sorry, there's just no real way I can say Lodestone without sounding like Dark Helmet from the movie Spaceballs.
Darkhawk breaks up a drug deal at Midtown High, with all of it being witnessed by Chris Powell's friend Steve Rubino, aka Headset. Of course, none of this is paid off at all for Chris's social life, as he's constantly had to bounce back and forth between Darkhawk and his family, which has obviously in turn strained his relationship with Cheryl. Later, while Chris is roughhousing with his brothers, he inadvertently opens up a small panel containing his father's hidden notes. As this plays out, Grace is visiting a private investigator named Harry Lennox to track down Mike's whereabouts. Meanwhile, Philip Bazin orders a few more rounds of tests on Lodestone, who's basically a woman in a cybersuit given the powers of Magneto.
I know what you're thinking, and no, this is not Allegra Bazin. This is just some other woman who's just really not that important.
Bazin orders Lodestone to take down Darkhawk and Grace Powell in no particular order. Later, when Darkhawk is breaking up another drug deal, Chris is horrified to realize that Headset was tailing him and got caught in the crossfire. He desperately tries to save his friend by placing the Darkhawk amulet on Headset, but the teen has completely lost consciousness at this point, and so the power armor can't form around him. Chris tries to change back, only to be suddenly interrupted by the appearance of Lodestone. Thankfully, Lodestone is unaware of Chris's identity as Darkhawk as she didn't see him change, and he's able to bluff her away long enough to get Headset to a hospital. That being said, the constant sight of Lodestone beginning attacking random civilians is enough to call Darkhawk out to take her on. She manages to mop the floor with him, and it's only through Philippe Bazin's interference via a remote control device that she's able to bring him back alive for study. Bazin straps Darkhawk down and begins experimenting on ways to pry the amulet off of his chest, which gets interrupted by Allegra, who needs money for a new car. This gives Chris enough opportunity to transform back into his human form and slip free. Darkhawk and Lodestone then begin fighting again, smashing the controller device that Bazin was using to keep Lodestone in check. However, Allegra manages to grab the backup device and uses it to allow Darkhawk to escape for some reason.
Meanwhile, the private investigator Harry Lennox informs Grace Powell he does have some information on her husband, but he needs for a particular source to just come through. And that's not entirely true, as shortly after Grace leaves, Harry receives a phone call from someone who informs her to just do what he can to keep her in the dark.
The Punisher trains his sniper rifle on some goons, failing to realize that he himself is being targeted by Savage Steel. The two then begin a game of cat and mouse throughout most of Queens as Chris visits Headset in the hospital. Chris is waffling on whether or not to explain to Cheryl and the rest of his friends about his situation as Darkhawk, as the two slip out to a mall to go get some Frogurt. It's then that the Punisher and Savage Steel come blasting through, and it forces Chris to lie about calling SWAT to leave Cheryl and turn into Darkhawk. Darkhawk is willing to help Castle out, but that gets interrupted by a bunch of Mafia goons attacking. The trio of Savage Steel, the Punisher, and Darkhawk are actually forced to work together long enough to take down all the goons. That being said, as soon as it's over, Savage Steel immediately turns on Punisher, and the two wind up fighting away. This all comes to an end with everyone scattering when the police arrive. Elsewhere, Harry Lennox tells Grace to head home as he has to meet with his source in private at a diner. It's probably for a good reason that this is in private, as it turns out the source is none other than Mike Powell, who can't have his family getting in the way of his big plans.
And that concludes our look at Darkhawk Classic Volume 1. How was it? Well, on the plus side, I did like a lot of the storytelling in this. I think it was kind of grounded, and I did like seeing the traumatic experiences the Powells go through. I mean, especially the way it's characterized with one of the children being in denial about their father taking a bribe, even though it clearly happened right in front of their face. Unfortunately, that's kind of where the compliments end. The artwork is just a little too scatterbrained and unfocused. I mentioned the coloring mistakes earlier. I mean, other things that happen, like hairstyles and clothing styles change mid-story, even though we're in the exact same place that we were the last time. And to be honest, outside of the Powell family, I find the supporting cast to be mostly lacking. Chris's high school clique add absolutely nothing to the story. Like I said, I barely remember that he was in a relationship with someone until that person popped up to take him to task for not being around so much. I mean, build the supporting characters up a little bit. Have them play more of a role in their lives. They should have been in the first issue, and they're not really outside of one panel where it's two people who don't show up again for the rest of the book. So again, this should have been planned out a little bit more. Not to mention the coloring, like I said. This book was remastered. You could have gone back and fixed the coloring errors. And just, yeah, like I said, unfortunately that just really bogged down whatever enjoyment I had in this book. It really delayed it a lot, and unfortunately I think it ruined the gravitas of a lot of these situations. So, unfortunately, I'm going to have to give Darkhawk Classic Volume 1 a D. I know there are some really die-hard Darkhawk fans out there, and I'm not jumping on you or anything for liking this. If you like it, that's fine. Just, it wasn't exactly my cup of tea. And with that, let's see what we'll be doing next time on the Random Trade Review.
Hey guys, remember you can help support the channel at patreon.com/sleepytimeforcat productions. There you can request a trade to be put in the randomizer, aka the cardboard box. And as always, remember to like, comment, share, subscribe, and ring that notification bell.